Hello and welcome back to Metahumanism podcast, where we investigate the contemporary world at the intersection of metahumanism, metamodernism, and decolonialism, with a Ukrainian accent. Today's episode will be a kind of an introductory one to a new series dedicated to the philosophies of war. This topic is obviously highly relevant these days, very complex, as any large-scale human phenomenon tends to be, but especially war, which is, violence, why it happens, how it starts, how to end it, and all the other questions. Is peace possible? Is perpetual peace possible? There's, humans have been dealing with these questions philosophically and just thinking about these matters for throughout the history. So there's it's a very complex topic, obviously. But it's something that's worth discussing, and there's the way to approach it that systematically to understand it better. And I think it's important for everybody to think about it in a disciplined and in reasoned manner, not just emotional or reactions that are based in fear or misunderstanding of what war is and so on. And there's different ways of thinking about it, and that's what this series will be about. So to begin with, and the reason. Several months ago, I recorded a few episodes specifically about the war in Ukraine and the propaganda, historical myths that are being have been created by the Russian Empire historically, and then also the propaganda, these myths and the new lies are being used in the propaganda. So it's I recorded those two episodes a few months back, and then so this is just kind of a more systematic way of approaching this topic. Not just about Ukraine, and we will discuss different contexts and historical examples, but but obviously it's relevant to everything that goes on in the world. So just to situate this series intellectually, let's quickly recap the schematic breakdown of the philosophical disciplines, just to refresh it in the memory. So the core 5 branches of philosophy are metaphysics, epistemology, logic, ethics, and aesthetics. And in simple terms, it's basically about reality and the world, how the world is built, and the reality, being, becoming, so on. Knowledge and truth, that's epistemology. Logic is method of investigation and how to use it and so on, and different ways of using reasoning. Morality and behavior is ethics, is what ethics is about, and good life, and beauty and art is aesthetics. Just to encapsulate it. So there are additionally a number of specialized disciplines within philosophy, branches of philosophy, dedicated for example to the mind, to science, religion, history, language, politics, society, economics, let's say, and so on. There's different branches you could. So by investigating war, by talking about war, we are moving into the specialized field of philosophy, which is political philosophy. Obviously, war and politics are interrelated. So today, I will first of all distinguish between political philosophy and political science. I think it's important to make that distinction, just to clarify things. Then provide a brief overview of the main central questions with which political philosophy is usually preoccupied, and then provide also a brief overview of the history of political philosophy. If time allowing, I might also start discussing the issue of violence and war, bringing us to the core topic of this series I'm beginning today. We'll get into this in greater detail, but I'll just mention some names, some recognizable, some of them are more recognizable than others, but names that are relevant here to start us off. So let's begin with the ancient times, the Chinese thinkers such as Confucius and Sun Tzu. Sun Tzu's work, The Art of War, is considered a classic in this genre. Philosophy of War, I mean. Ancient epics are relevant here, like Greek epics. Homer, obviously, he wrote the Iliad, the Odyssey, are both about wars. Different wars. The Trojan War, Odyssey is about not about but both related to Trojan War and the consequences of it. The Odyssey is more about returning from the war, as the Odysseus was returning home. And then Indian epics also, like Mahabharata, it talks about war. It discusses war. Obviously, it's a human phenomenon. It's not exclusive to the West or any other part of the world. So there's perspectives all over the world we can use and discuss. There's also Mesoamerican perspectives, like Aztec ceremonial wars. We'll take a look at just for to an additional point of view. Greek historians like Herodotus and Thucydides, I'm sorry. They wrote about different wars, the Persian wars, the Peloponnesian wars from ancient history, and then the Greek and Roman, and also Roman historians like Livy or Polybius also wrote about later in later antiquity. Greek and Roman philosophers also thought about the war as a phenomenon. Heraclitus is relevant. Plato, his work The Republic, for example, is a classical work on politics. Aristotle, his work on politics also. Cicero, well known. Marcus Aurelius, a Stoic philosopher and an emperor, Roman emperor. So that's antiquity. Then in the medieval times, we get into more theological thinking about war and the more of a just war theory. So war is starting to be theorized in terms of ethics and how to conduct yourself during war. Not that there weren't ethical considerations before, but this is more explicitly a theory of war itself as being just by Saint Augustine, for example, or Thomas Aquinas. In Western tradition, also Islamic theorists with the way that jihad and distinction between offensive and defensive wars and so on, and how to conduct yourself during the war. Then next step was the early modern or Renaissance. And the subsequent theorists such as Machiavelli and Hobbes are the most prominent ones. They're realist thinkers, what we know today as realist, what we call today realist thinking. Legalists also, such as Grotius and Pufendorf, are two other thinkers from earlier modernity. Next, we get to modern times, modern philosophy, modern political thinking, which just kind of starts already with Machiavelli and Hobbes as early modern thinkers, but the proper modernities with the Enlightenment, Kant and his idea of perpetual peace is important tradition. Hegel with his philosophy of history, Marx with his struggle of the classes, obviously was very influential on the 20th century, as we know. So just to an overview, obviously. So especially also in this period, Clausewitz, that's a classic work on war, vom Kriege in German. And he was his theory was very influential in German context, and not just German, but specifically because of the Prussian and the subsequent history of German imperialism and world wars. It's relevant. Also a very kind of realist perspective on war. And it was revived into 20th century by certain thinkers within American tradition. So then there's pacifist philosophies, again, perpetual peace from Kant, but also other. It was in the 19th century it gained traction, was internationalist perspective. Tolstoy's War and Peace is also well-known work. Freud's theory about aggression is relevant here. Lenin's theory of revolution, world revolution, and what it caused, the atrocities of that. And then subsequent developments throughout the 20th century and into till today. We'll look at all those little by little, progressively in this series. Taking our time just to have a good understanding of all of this. So to sum up the overall progression of very schematically, very briefly, the philosophy of war evolved from seeing war as human nature and divine law, in a sense, or something like a fatalist way of thinking, into more political and strategic way of thinking, so more realist, as we would call it today. And then evolved additionally with a focused on psychology and technology, psychology of war and technology used in the war. So more, I guess, scientific, you could say, way of looking at things. And then finally, the ethical perspective of today, where ethics, decolonialism, and post-humanism, and meta-humanism, and these kind of perspectives are relevant, and trying to rethink and how the approaches to war and how to think and understand war and how to deal with it. It's not nearly so linear as I just walked through it, obviously, because the political and strategic perspective, the realist way of looking at war, was already present in the ancient world. As I mentioned, Sun Tzu's work, The Art of War, is very about strategy, about how to defeat the opponent without even engaging in combat, sort of very strategy. So even psychology of your opponent is very intelligence gathering is already there's a lot in it, and that's why it's been revived in the 20th century. Kind of this work is very popular in some ways, and it has a lot to teach and a lot of wisdom, you could say, that explains or war and strategy, and so is relevant to today. So as I said, this realist or strategic way of thinking was already present in ancient times, along with the fatalist way of thinking about war, and then also subsequently, these kind of fatalistic, ethical, realist, even scientific ways of thinking about war kind of intermingled and waxed and waned throughout history. The warfare and war technology, weaponry technology improved through time, and it revolutionized warfare along the way. Like a cannon, for example, revolutionized warfare, and then obviously gunpowder even early before that. So these inventions and science along the progress of history, meaning the progression of history, not with any kind of destination in mind, but just the way history developed. It obviously, the development of technology is an important factor in it, and it's not that only now in modern times where technology it's become maybe more prevalent and more dominant, obviously, with now AI and drones being used in warfare in Ukraine, and it's actually evolving at a breakneck speed. This is true. Every 2 weeks, some kind of technology needs to be updated, software or drone technology. This is just mind-boggling that you, to stay ahead and to be able to defend yourself from Ukrainian point of view, you have to keep updating your software, your hardware, and just stay on top of it. So it's a real aspect of warfare now, and so it's things change, and they are changing now as we speak again. So this is all relevant for today's world. But in rough terms, so this is schematic. It's not linear, but in rough terms, each subsequent era, if you think of it from fatalist to realist to scientific and to ethical, kind of, it's more like emphasizing the maybe the dominant perspective on war, or the more emphasis is being put on a certain way of thinking. So each subsequent era integrated the lessons and failures of the previous one and created a layered understanding of what war is, why it happens, and how humans should approach it, basically. And that's what we will be talking about in the next several episodes, however many it comes to be. We'll see. But let's begin with the introductory survey of political philosophies first, as I just described it. First, I will make a distinction between political philosophy and political science. It's just for clarity's sake, because intuitively, perhaps not everybody understands the difference without looking into it more specifically. So they're related fields, obviously. Political philosophy historically predates political science as a disciplined modern way of approaching things. So you could say political science emerged subsequently out of political philosophy in a way. But now they coexist and they are interrelated and they inform one another. But they both examine aspects of politics, but differ in how they focus on it, what methods they use, and the goals of their investigations. Just to pinpoint some of the differences, first is the focus and the questions asked. So political philosophy, it's more normative and conceptual. So it's more explores questions about how things ought to be, rather than how things are, or what is. So political philosophy tends to be more, it may be conceptualize how things are in a way, but it's more typically focused more on prescription or advice, or how things should work, or theorizing about how things could work better. And that example would be Kant's perpetual peace. Obviously, no perpetual peace was reached because he created that theory, but it's been influential and influenced many other thinkers since that time. So, for example, that's how philosophy is influential here, and then can be helpful. So, core questions of philosophy, political philosophy, is what is justice? Since the times of Plato, that was one of the major concerns of political thinking. What is justice? How do you define it? How do you practice it? What makes a government legitimate? What kind of government is legitimate or is ideal? Even slightly utopian kind of thinking. What rights do individuals have? How should power be distributed, and so on? So just some examples. Aim of political philosophy is to develop ethical frameworks, theories of the ideal state, understand the principles that underlie political life, and so on. Now, political science, it's more empirical, descriptive, and explanatory, rather than normative and conceptual. So it investigates how political systems actually work in practice. So it's more of that's what scientific about it. It's empirical. It's looking at how things are, describing them, studying them, understanding them better, explaining how things work, trying to find at least explanations as much as possible, and describe to have a better understanding of the realities. Core questions: how do elections function, for example, if it's a democratic system? What factors influence voter behavior? How do institutions shape policy outcomes? So this is more general, institutions in any kind of system. What causes political conflict, and so on. So to describe, the aim is to describe, explain, predict political behavior and institutional dynamics using systematic research methods. So much more scientific even in formulation, right? The aim. So that's why it's called political science rather than political philosophy. Methodology. is a next dimension. So political philosophy typically uses analytical methods, so critical reasoning, conceptual analysis, normative argumentation. There's just to name a few. Historical theoretical analysis is also relevant here, like engaging with classical texts, like talking about Sun Tzu, histories of Herodotus and Plato and Aristotle and so on, Kant and so on. Classical texts, ethical theories, abstract principles. Political science, on the other hand, again, more empirical methods, employ statistical analysis, surveys, case studies, experiments, even as much as possible in comparative research. All of these are some of the ways investigations are performed in political science. And it's data-driven. It uses quantitative and qualitative research to test hypotheses and develop theories that are based on observed political behavior. So more scientific, more methodical and systematic approach. Not that there's no method or systematic approach in philosophy. It's just different types of methodology. Third dimension is goals and outcomes. So for political philosophy, as I said, it kind of echoes the beginning, that the normative aspect, normative guidance. So philosophy seeks to establish certain ideals, ethical standards for political institutions and practices, to guide statesmen, to guide politicians. So to provide some conceptual clarity, to clarify concepts like liberty, equality, justice, authority, what they mean, how they should be practiced. So it's provide ethical and philosophical guidance on governance, to sum up. Political science, it's more predictive and explanatory, just aims to understand and forecast political events, decision-making, institutional performance, and it goes beyond sometimes these technologies. You could say these are technologies, political technologies or scientific methods are used to manipulate sometimes. That's the nefarious side of it, that the data can be used to manipulate these institutions and processes and then cause certain outcomes or manipulate sentiments, public opinion, and so on. It's all part of the. That's not what the aim of political science explicitly is, but sometimes the results of political science are used that way, and certain political scientists have. It's a myth that science is value neutral. That is not. That has never been true. There's always it's this pretense to value neutrality is a part of the problem with science sometimes, that scientists pretend to not have values, and science is somehow completely objective and non-judgmental. That's not true. There are assumptions everybody makes when doing science. Every scientist is a human being. Human being makes assumptions, has unconscious motives and all kinds of things. So scientists are not value neutral, and they try to approach more objective way of looking. There's a method, there's a system they use, yes, but there are also values inherent in the scientific endeavor, and that must be recognized, and it has been recognized, but not everybody understands that. So these arguments have been pretty prominent within scientific disciplines of all kinds for many years, for many decades, maybe even centuries in some ways, but definitely in 20th century as social sciences developed to become more influential. So policy relevant research is another aspect of this political science. Is these research, data driven research and information knowledge gained from that research contributes to policy debates and to policy recommendations, providing empirical evidence on how political systems and societies function. That's part of the social science the way it is utilized in society is that it affects the processes in society itself, and that's the reflexive nature of social scientific endeavor. So the way natural science is not quite, I mean, I guess if you talk about quantum physics, it gets to the point, but generally nature or physics and natural sciences are less prone to this reflexivity, because you're studying nature to on a certain level, above certain level. On quantum level, things get a little bit more uncertain, as we've discovered in the 20th century. But generally speaking, natural sciences, it's easier to be objective and use methods which are more objective, not as much as it's very different that way from social sciences, and that's also something that is often overlooked, how social sciences are very, very different from natural sciences. They may be seen as part of the scientific endeavor overall, but they can't use exactly same methods, and the different types of philosophies and assumptions underlie these two aspects of science, social and natural. So, and you can't bridge them. There is no way to approach everything with the same kind of perspective, same kind of method. You have to use different methods that to study different things. That's just the nature of it. Even that's true even within natural sciences. You can't study biology and physics. There's different instruments, different methods you have to use, even though there's some commonality at the foundation. Okay, so overall, to sum up, political science offers evidence-based insights which can inform policy decisions. Okay, so both philosophy as a guidance, philosophical, ethical, normative guidance, and political science as an evidence-based empirical field of knowledge. They inform, and then they should inform, and they do inform politics as practice in society. So they're both relevant. Both fields influence each other. They can and they do. Normative ideas in political philosophy often shape the questions the political scientist asks. Again, this is the idea of it's not value free. You do use certain assumptions, and then you ask questions based on those, and try to get data to answer those questions. And also empirical findings may sometimes be surprising or non-intuitive, or show something that leads to rethinking of certain political theories or normative theories, because the evidence shows something that wasn't expected or wasn't theorized or conceptualized in any way before, and you have to account for that. And also just the realities of social practices in societies, which is, I guess, they are filtered through science, but even if there aren't, just by what happens in society, it also affects how philosophers and thinkers conceptualize and think about things. So and now let's talk about, so that's the distinction between political philosophy and political science. Just two different sides of the coin, if you will. As far as political practice, these are just two ways of approaching politics, and then the politics is kind of a third area of practice, which draws both on philosophy, philosophical thinking, and scientific research. Now, main problems of political philosophy, meaning the main questions that political philosophy struggles with or grapples with. These are fundamental questions about how societies should be organized, how power should be distributed, what principles should guide political life. These are like very overarching, broad questions. But to more focused, I will give you a set of 9. This is just one framework. It's not meant to be exhaustive or comprehensive, but it covers a lot of ground. So it's heuristic. As I discussed this notion of heuristic, it's helpful to just frame the discussion, but it doesn't pretend to be the only true way of looking at things, or the only possible way of breaking things down, but it's just one of them. So one is legitimacy and authority. That's an important issue. What makes a government or state legitimate? Right? What legitimizes power? Institutions and structures, for example, constitution, let's say, or divine rights of kings in the medieval times, or early, so these kind of theories. How is political authority justified? When is it acceptable to challenge it, or to overthrow a government? It's obvious, where it can lead to, the thinking, and it's relevant. So we'll discuss these as we go along. Second aspect is justice and the distribution of resources. Again, what is a just society? How should goods, opportunities, burdens be distributed among citizens? What are the principles of distributive and retributive justice? Distributive meaning who gets what, having a pie, who gets how much of the pie, and retributive in meaning if some injustice was done, how do you compensate for it? There's also a notion of restorative justice. That's another perspective in addition to distributive and retributive. Distributive, basically, it's you can think of it as, for example, social state, social welfare state. Retributive justice, example, just punishment, crime and punishment, law enforcement, and so on, police, law and order, so to speak. And restorative is, it's some ideas about, historical injustices. How do you make up for them and compensate? Do you do it directly, or do you just, like affirmative action, for example, it could be seen as one way of approaching restorative justice, paying reparations, war reparations, and things like that. That's just broad overview. Third important question is freedom and liberty, obviously. A major one. What does it mean to be free, both individually and collectively, as a society, as a nation, let's say, as a state? How should, and these are all different concepts, by the way, in political philosophy: state, nation, society, and community. These are all, they're not the same. They sometimes can coincide in some ways, but they are not the same, and they all, it's important. This is where conceptual clarity in philosophy matters, because it's important to distinguish these different ideas and different concepts, and because if somebody who doesn't have either education or understanding, or really civic education enough, to make these distinctions, that's where problems come in, because politicians can manipulate these notions of nation state and community and capitalize on those misunderstandings of the terms. So that's relevant to any one of the major issues: freedom and liberty. How should individual liberties be balanced against the needs and security of society as a whole, let's say, and society or state? What's the role? And that's a role of the state is kind of also a major separate question, you could say. Next, and that's actually the next issue, really, the role of the state. That's the fourth now. So again, it was legitimacy, authority, justice, freedom and liberty, and then now role of the state is the fourth one. What functions should the state perform? Protection, welfare, regulation, and so on, so on, so on. How much power should the state have? Where should the limits be drawn? There's different answers, obviously. Fifth issue is equality and rights. How can societies ensure equality before the law and in practice, right? So what does equality mean? What exactly? Overemphasis on equality leads to some some atrocities, really. In 20th century, you know, this whole Soviet communism and this whole ideology and even you can go back as far as French Revolution, also certain ideas about equality without proper understanding of what it means, this equality, it can lead to some bad results. The French Revolution is an example of that. The terror and the dictatorship and then the Napoleonic Wars that followed the revolution. So what rights do individuals have is another question. How are these rights protected or constrained by political institutions, so like the constitutional order and so on. The sixth issue is democracy and participation. What are the best forms of governance in general? And this dates back to the ancient Greek and Roman times, when republic, empire, city-states, all of these, you know, and then on in Renaissance also against city-states in Italy, or various statelets in Holy German Empire, or the French state and feudalism, and how it should be organized, the society should be organized, church versus state, all these matters are relevant here. So how should citizens participate in political decision making, basically? What are the implications of different democratic models? And before democracy became dominant, you know, there were other models also, so political philosophy thought about those. And there's actually a moment now that there are a lot of anti-democratic thinkers emerging now these days, which they need to be opposed because they obviously want to revive some of the older ideas under the new guise, and with the new technologies that to control people, and they think democracy is wrong or is not effective or is a bad system, and they argue for other systems, which is a problem. So it has to be guarded against. But this is where political philosophy is important. Next issue is political obligation and citizenship. Again, a major one. You know, what duties do the citizens owe to the state and to each other within society? Why should individuals obey laws? What happens when laws or government actions are unjust? Obviously, and this is also connects to the very first issue of legitimacy and authority, right? So when do the laws and whatever the law is, if it's unjust, and when does it become illegitimate, or where its authority is void, you know, and civil disobedience, and so these are all important questions. Eighth issue is power and conflict, and that's kind of undergirding everything here. But it's you have to understand what power is, how it functions, what it represents, and how it's practiced. How is it distributed and exercised within societies? What causes political conflict, and what mechanisms can be used to resolve disputes peacefully rather than violence or force? A few things that come to mind would be Marx's idea, obviously, is relevant because of the way it infected the 20th century, the class struggle and his conceptualization. Very reductionistic, very simplistic, because there's not just bourgeoisie and proletariat. Obviously, there's more groups, and but his perspective was influential also in developing in sociology a conflict theory of, yes, there are classes in society, there are groups, whatever you want to call them, classes, groups, so on. Nationality, even ethnicities, let's say, within one maybe country or one nation, there are different groups, ethnical groups, or different subgroups or subcultures or whatever, you know. So you could these issues are explored in political science typically, but also political philosophy. But the basic issue, the fundamental issue is this idea is that there is conflict within societies. That's just a fact of it's a historical fact. We all know that history is just, as the joke goes, one damn thing after another, right? So there's conflict. And how to resolve that conflict, and war is, we're kind of approaching that, the central issue of this whole theory is basically the philosophy of war. Is conflict can turn into war, can turn violent and forceful, and how do you prevent that from happening? How do you create mechanisms to resolve things peacefully? Because conflict is not in itself is not necessarily bad or evil. Conflict will, even in any relationship, there's bound to be some conflict. It's a matter of how do you approach it, how do you resolve it. Yeah, that's what it's conflict resolution is about. And last, ninth issue in this list is a kind of overarching global justice and international relations, and that kind of, I was already leading up to it, meaning, peace and conflict resolution. How do you end wars when they start? How do you prevent wars from erupting in the first place? And it's these are very complex issues. There's no it's very easy, as you struggle or grapple with these things, it's easy to get disheartened or cynical or jaded or just even nihilistic, saying, oh, it's all about power, it doesn't matter, no values, it's just about who has more power than another, and that what determines, might makes right. But no, that's not exactly true. If you think of it that way, then it becomes reality, because you behave that correspondingly. This is part of the issue with social sciences, is that and society as whole, what you believe and what you think, it affects how you behave. And so you have to be careful how you think and what concepts you use and what you believe, because it affects obviously how you build your life, everything, and that's why philosophy and political philosophy, especially in this context, important is to, because the ideas about society and how we think and what we believe, and religion comes into this as well. As I said, in the medieval times there was this idea of just war, and religion, theology was connected to it. So it's not only bad. The religion doesn't only have a bad influence on politics or on conflict. It also has positive. A lot of religions teach peace. It just doesn't often lead to peace because of the other factors that are involved in humanity and societies. But it's important to have clarity of thinking, and that doesn't mean that you necessarily can prevent things or prevent violence or prevent conflict or prevent evil from having a place in the world, but without clear thinking, it's impossible to deal with those phenomena correctly or appropriately, or to understand them well. And misunderstanding is very often is a root cause of the conflict. Generally, just basic misunderstanding or some offense taken by or different interests, different visions of future, and again, power struggle for territory or for domination, hegemony. Obviously, all of this. That's why all of these 9 issues, and I will just quickly recap them. Legitimacy and authority is 1. Justice. Freedom and liberty is 3. Role of the state, equality and rights, democracy and participation, 6. 7 is political obligation and citizenship, and 9, power and conflict. I'm sorry, that's 7, 8, power and conflict, and 9 is global justice and international relations and possibility of conflict resolution. In that, so I think that's a pretty broad set of issues, which all are relevant and all are sufficiently complex in the each in its own right. So we can't ever exhaustively examine all of them, but we will obviously approach some of these as we talk about philosophies of war. Lastly today, what I will do, just in terms of the time I think I will just still provide the overview of political philosophy and how it developed, at least the mainstream sort of tradition, I would say. Obviously, it's a Western tradition, but I will try to include other perspectives as well. So, which obviously I mentioned Sun Tzu previously, and Indian epics and so on. So there will be other perspectives considered in the future episodes, but this overview right now is mostly Western focused. So, starting with the ancient political philosophy. The Greek political thought may be said to have started with Plato and Aristotle, so classical Greek philosophy. Plato advocated for an ideal state. His work, The Republic, is very famous for that. Has some very interesting ideas, let's put it that way. Some of them are quite extreme, I would say, and there's different ways of interpreting them. So, but he did advocate this kind of in that particular dialogue, or the Republic. He talked about the ideal state and philosopher kings as the ideal people to rule others, meaning, rulers who are also philosophers. So wise people who can administer things well. That was his idealization, at least. The history and kind of undermines that idealization, that generally people who are good philosophers don't necessarily make good politicians or statesmen. And even within Ukrainian example, Ukrainian history, for example, if we take an example of World War I, there was a Ukrainian revolution, the Ukrainian People's Republic was established, and the president of that republic was elected to be a historian, Mikhailo Hrushevsky. He was a, whatever opinions may vary about him as a historian, but he was definitely a good scholar, excellent scholar, defining scholar in Ukrainian history. But as a statesman, he had some good ideas, but in terms of how he practiced, he was not really a good politician or statesman. He made mistakes, and not just he personally. There are people who surrounded him as well. It was it's a whole another episode, I would say, but that's an example. So good historian does not necessarily make a good statesman or good politician, and these examples can be taken even in from any countries, I would say, probably. History, the wisest people don't necessarily get to rule the country in terms of political power, and not necessarily they would be better at it than others who are wielding the power. So that's just a general consideration. So Plato emphasized, he talked a lot about justice, what it is, how to achieve it, and then what a common good is, and so on. Aristotle, his perspective, he approached many things more like an empirically and scientifically. He kind of proto-scientific worldview in his philosophy, really. He tried to systematize philosophy and make it more scientific, if you will, in terms of ancient antiquity. So he viewed politics as practical science, in a way, emphasizing the role of citizens in achieving virtue and good life, within a well-ordered polis. Polis is a city-state, that's the political community, polis. So Roman contributions subsequently to Greek, classical Greece. Cicero is a very influential thinker and statesman and practitioner of politics. He integrated Greek ideas with Roman notions of law and civic duty, republicanism. Even in imperial times, there was kind of these republican virtue, and at the core of that thinking, laying the groundwork for this theories of natural law and republican ideals subsequently were revived in the Renaissance and subsequently in Enlightenment and so on. And as we know, for example, the American founders studied classical Greece and Rome very deeply. as it was kind of a fashion to do since the Renaissance, starting with the Renaissance, with the revival of the classical education, meaning ancient Greece and Rome, and those texts and ideas were revived and adapted to the more modern times. Okay, so that's Antiquity. Next is we're moving into the Middle Ages. Political philosophy, and as I said, there's more theological thinking, namely Christian in terms of Europe, let's say. Thomas Aquinas. Augustine interpreted politics in light of Christian theology, emphasizing the tension between the earthly city and the city of God. So in his work, it's famous, kind of these two cities of heavenly kingdom in a way, and the kingdom on earth. So how do you reconcile the two different, the spiritual and the real, the political reality? Thomas Aquinas, he merged Aristotelian philosophy with Christian doctrine. That was his general approach to philosophy, and he formulated ideas that focused on natural law, justice, and legitimacy of rulers. Divine right and feudalism is important here. The medieval period also saw the emergence of this idea of divine rights of kings, where authority was seen as sanctioned by God, and the political order was maintained through feudal relationships. Early modern political philosophy is the next step, and that's where realism, as we know it today, started to emerge again. Realism and humanism. Niccolo Machiavelli, his work The Prince is a classical one in that sense, kind of a pragmatic, sometimes amoral, which is different from immoral. So basically kind of putting morality aside, just looking really at how politics functions and how to work within politics, kind of how to exercise power, statecraft. But actually what Machiavelli wrote and thought about is very different from how he was interpreted by subsequently. So what we know as Machiavellian today, it's associated with this manipulation and immorality and kind of almost deception. And there is some truth to that what he wrote about kind of advocates for that kind of statecraft, but there's much more to his writing and his perspective than that. So it's just to as with any philosopher, that's you always have to distinguish between what a philosopher thought and what he was interpreted as saying later. And this we saw this recently when I was talking about Skovoroda and how Plato's philosophy, what he wrote, how Neoplatonism completely rethought or reformulated it in a very something that is very distinct. It's not Plato anymore. It's something else. And then also how it was reinterpreted later on in modernity and so on. So the same thing here. Also relevant here is social contract theories, and some of the theorists, the major ones would be Thomas Hobbes, his because of metaphor of Leviathan as the state, and the state of nature being war against of all against all, kind of anarchy, and so the state is needed to impose order, and that's his justification of absolute monarchy, in a way. So, but he wrote it that in an influential manner, contributing to the overall tradition of social contract theories. John Locke is another one. He was more relevant to American context because a lot of British, being a British philosopher, political philosopher, he influenced a lot of the American founders and their way of thinking. And he was also within the social contract theory, but he was more proponent a liberal point of view in comparison to Hobbes. That governments derive their authority from the consent of the governed, right? So the individuals possess the rights to life, liberty, and property, which Thomas Jefferson, as I recently covered him in the previous episode, actually changed it to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. But that was the John Locke's contribution. And then another important one is Jean-Jacques Rousseau, French theorist. He influenced, obviously, the French Revolution and how that developed with his ideas, but also he wrote a work called Social Contract, and emphasized popular sovereignty, general will, and there are some issues with that concept as well, with political philosophy and criticism of what it means. So, but he suggested that true freedom is found in participating in collective self-rule, so collective self-determination of a nation or a community. Yeah. So then in the 19th century, the next step as modern philosophy developed, some of the dominant currents of thinking were liberalism, post-French Revolution, liberalism, utilitarianism, and thinkers like Jeremy Bentham, John Stuart Mill, some of the prominent ones. There's many others, and practitioners, obviously. It influenced practical politics, but these are just the most prominent philosophers that are studied often and in introductory courses in universities, if you will. Promoted, so these liberals and the utilitarianism are not exactly the same. They're different, distinct, but they're connected in some ways. But they promoted the idea that the best polities maximize overall happiness, so the greatest happiness of the greatest number of people, and that influences the debates on what the rights and reforms, how to conduct, and what does it mean, and how do you calculate that happiness of the greatest number of people, and so on. And there are a lot of slippery slopes in that thinking as well. Liberalism is not a panacea; it has its limits, and but that's a matter for another discussion, a separate discussion. Also, there was Marxism that emerged during the 19th century. Marx and Engels, they critiqued capitalist society. Obviously, they created this communist, socialist, Marxist synthesis, class struggle, and so on. And we all familiar with it pretty much. Although there's so many misunderstandings of what they said, and again how it was later interpreted by others, such as Lenin, for example, distorted or developed in Mao and in other kind of I don't know if evil is the right word, but counterproductive and distortive manner. But that's why political philosophy is important, to understand these ideas and because they affect everything in life. And knowing their source is important. So obviously historical materialism is connected. The idea of what historical materialism, revolutionary restructuring of society, that's Marxism. And also another dominant tradition that's still relevant to these days is conservatism. Edmund Burke, Irish-British philosopher, was kind of the founding father of that tradition. As a reaction to the French Revolution, he wrote a very famous Reflections on the Revolutions in France, and that was kind of a founding text of the conservative perspective and the movement that emerged subsequently in political practices. He reacted against this radical kind of change. He emphasized tradition, social order, gradual evolution of institutions, and so on. And today, I mean, all of these traditions of thought have a kernel of truth in them and have important things to contribute to general understanding. And it's not the way the debate is now framed: liberals versus conservatives, and there's no overlap, or Democrats versus Republicans today. That's just, it's primitive in many ways. The reality is much more complex, and both conservatism and liberalism and even socialism all have something to contribute and something to teach us if we are open to learning. And you don't have to be ideologically dug into your positions and reject everything about something because it's comes from that other tradition that is not yours. That is very immature and primitive in many ways. And this is what leads to not being able to resolve conflicts and to seek peaceful resolution, and that leads to violence or forceful conflict in societies and between societies. And finally, last step along the way is the 20th century and contemporary, the 21st century. Political philosophy developed. Obviously, liberalism has been very dominant tradition, and democratic theory connected to it, liberal democracy. Again, renewed focus on individual rights, justice, democratic governance. One prominent theorist is John Rawls. His theory of justice is also taught in some of the introductory courses in universities as modern way of rethinking. And there are issues with his approach as well. But Robert Nozick is a kind of a more libertarian anarchist philosopher. That's another name that I could name from remembering from some of the courses I took. But the focus on democracy, how to make democratic justice work, fairness, equality, how to make that work in contemporary societies, and so on. And typically, in this moment right now, democracy is kind of globally is under assault in many ways, and that's why it's important to be clear about these values and these importance of these ideas and how to defend them. So second aspect is critical theory and post-structuralism. So first was liberalism in terms of contemporary political philosophy. Critical theory and post-structuralism, it builds on many different strains of thinking and even philosophy, linguistic philosophy, structuralism, and so on, and we will examine those in some future episodes in different series. But that's Frankfurt School, for example, of philosophy, and thinkers influenced by Foucault, Michel Foucault, French post-structuralist philosopher. They examine power structures, ideology, ways how political power is embedded in cultural and social practices, how it's not separate and it's not benign. So culture also is deeply political in many ways. Often science can be deeply political. All of that, art, and you can't really neatly separate these things as some people like to argue. So that's another perspective. Another is libertarian. I already mentioned libertarianism and communitarianism. These are slightly different. So obviously libertarians focus on minimal state intervention, individual rights above all, individual freedom, while communitarians are kind of they emphasize community, importance of community values and collective social responsibilities. Not denying the individual rights, but also emphasizing the community and collective values have a say within the framework of freedom and liberty. Next aspect is identity politics and multiculturalism. We're all familiar with that, I'm sure. Contemporary debates about the group rights, that there's subcultures or indigenous cultures or minorities within society of all kinds that deserve recognition and deserve to be equal in how they are able to practice their identity. And I'm thinking it doesn't just ethnic minorities, sexual minorities, gender or sexual minorities. I will include that in one group. Minorities like immigrants, immigrant minorities, and so on. So these explore like feminist, post-colonial theory are relevant here, global justice approaches. They're more universalizing narratives, trying to focus on the rights and identities of marginalized groups and highlight them, and that have been neglected in history. And it's an important perspective. Sometimes it gets to emphasize to the extreme. Identity politics sometimes can be very counterproductive, as we all know. So there is, again, this is important to know the balance. political philosophy is important. And lastly, globalization and cosmopolitanism. That's a very dominant strain of thought, especially in late 20th century and beginning of 21st century. Global interdependence, ideas of transnational justice, diasporas, transnational movements. How to address the continuing effects of former colonialism and then the emerging neo-colonialist practices, which can include technological, like AI, or economical, cultural imperialism. It's not necessarily political or warlike imperialism like Russia attacking Ukraine. There's also imperialism that is practiced through economic influence or through cultural influence, and that's like you could say, Hollywood is a representation of cultural imperialism, American cultural imperialism, because it's globalized, right? What Hollywood produces is viewed all over the world, and there's a lot of resistance in many cultures because it's they see it as foreign and they don't want to mimic it, but culture has a very deep political and social impact. So these are just some of the issues I'm highlighting that could be covered, but that's not what we will focus on going forward. This is just a part of the overview. Just to sum up for today, political philosophy evolved from these classical debates in ancient times about the ideal state, civic virtue, modern discussions about rights, justice, power in diverse pluralistic societies, right? So different historical contexts obviously pose different questions, require different kind of thinking and different kind of approaches and theorization. Each current within political philosophy reflects certain specific historical and cultural context in which that tradition arose, whether it emphasized reason, individual liberty, social order, equality, tradition, critical analysis of power and identity, and so on. And all of these perspectives are important and valid and should be accounted for as we go forward. So they illustrate the dynamic and broad and contested nature of political thought over time. So that's a good place to stop. Going forward, we will start next time. We will start talking about more specifically about war and violence in the context of society, states, violence, just human nature and interdependence, and what violence and what types of violence there are, because it's not just about physical violence. There are much more, many more different kinds of violence than just physical one. So we'll discuss that, and then we'll talk about philosophies of war, and we'll start talking specifically about war and how people thought about war since the ancient times till today. And then we'll go on in this series, progressing as the journey takes us along. So thank you for being and listening, being with me here and listening to what I have to say, and I hope you continue to do so. Please support this channel by liking, commenting, sharing, subscribing, telling others about it, and if you can support it financially, great. And please do support Ukraine also in any way you can, financially, morally, informationally, just by learning the truth, by understanding the context, and so on. Thank you very much, and I'll see you next time.